Elections are almost upon us. South African streets are filled with political party posters. The Center for Development and Enterprise says voters should go beyond the slogans and campaign promises. It says the electorate should look at policies that would put South Africa on the road to economic recovery. Among these issues will be job creation. To discuss this, we're joined by the Center's Anne Bernstein. Good evening, and thanks very much for your time. Now, people do talk about what's wrong with the ANC, for example, which has been governing this country for the past 25 years. But they don't seem keen to leave it, if polls are anything to go by. There's a record 48 political parties that want our votes in this election. But again, if polls are anything to go by, they're unprepared to go to these opposition parties in droves either.
Well, Vuyo, thanks for the opportunity. I'm not going to talk about voters and their politics. What we're trying to do is to say to voters and journalists, this is a very important election. We're deciding how South Africa is going to be governed for the next 5 years. And we're trying to encourage voters to ask tough questions of their political parties. We have multiple crises in this country. The housing crisis, our cities are expanding, our massive youth unemployment crisis. So what CDE is saying is ask tough questions. How are these political parties going to change the policies? How are they going to govern South Africa differently so that we move away from all the really bad things that are happening? How do we improve the quality of life? How do we create cities of hope and opportunity? And how are we going to turn the dial on our unbelievably large youth unemployment? So we're saying, ask your political party questions, demand answers, and think about these before you vote.
Well, the reason I asked the question that way was because, as I said, people know these realities, and they can make a distinction between, people who are making promises that they know can be fulfilled, and people who are making empty promises. They can tell the difference between empty slogans and people who actually mean, what they are saying. And I'm saying, yet in spite of all of that, you have South Africans behaving the way they do. And I'm not for a second suggesting that they're wrong. Maybe in spite of all that gets said, they decide consciously, that I am going to go for this party or the other party, irrespective of what I know to be the truth and the reality of it all.
Look, I have a lot more faith in South African individuals and voters than in most of our leaders at the moment, or most of our politicians. But what we're trying to do at the Center for Development and Enterprise as a policy organization, which is not party political, we're trying to contribute to this election by saying here are two issues we're focusing on, really growth, jobs, and cities. And we're providing facts and figures and trends, and we're really saying, think hard about these issues and interrogate the people who want to govern your city and province and the country on what they're going to do. So, for example, take housing. We have an impressive record where we have built some 3 to 4 million houses in the last 25 years. This is impressive. On the other hand, many of those are far away from economic opportunity. And inadvertently, it wasn't deliberate, we have expanded spatial apartheid for the poor rather than building the kind of much more efficient, dense cities that we need. Now, our cities are expanding. Young people in those cities are growing. Nearly 150 young people join the ranks of the unemployed every single day. These are important, vital issues. We're suggesting voters should be interrogating particular policies that politicians are offering and saying, how will it make things better? That's the key test. And then they must make up their own minds. So we're trying to push voters and politicians and journalists to be saying, South Africa's in desperate crisis on a number of fronts. Things are not good. How will you, Mr. Politician, political party, asking for my vote, change things? So yes, we are trying to push the electorate to think harder and deeper, perhaps, than they might have on these particular issues, and push their political parties in a way beyond the easy sort of, no, we're in favor of this or that. Our cities are expanding. What are you going to do? What is your attitude? Do you think the city should get allocated more powers and resources? The country's nearly 70% urbanized. What are you, Mr. Politician, going to do to make sure my children, my cousin's children, actually have a chance, a hope of a job? Because more of the same is clearly not going to get us there.
Well, it's interesting to say. I mean, I remember someone writing on social media over the past few days, pointing out the irony of these volunteers, you know, from the governing party in this instance, who were going around telling people that their party is focused on creating jobs. And the irony was that this person has been unemployed for a very long time, but has faith in the organization that they are campaigning for, that it will indeed create these jobs. And here's another item, which is a point you're raising. You're saying critical questions for an incoming government include whether to support the current focus on high labor standards and high wages at the expense of the unemployed, and ask any unionist in this country or worker who is employed and belongs to a union. That's the first thing that they do not believe that they could well be a stumbling block, you know, to job creation.
So I think that is the big question facing South Africa. How are we going to deal with lots of vested interests, and there are lots of us around, and talk about what's in the interests of all South Africans? And I think that is the enormous challenge that this election poses. Are we going to move in a new direction where the national interest will predominate rather than special interests? And we're saying that what's happened over the last 20, 25 years is we've raised the barriers to getting a job because of higher standards, which all sound like good things. Higher standards, higher wages for skilled, semi-skilled workers. This sounds good, but it makes employers...
would require a great deal of selflessness, isn't it?
Well,
isn't it?
I don't think it's selflessness. I think it is, how do our political leaders start to build a new narrative on how South Africa moves forward, and how all of us are going to have to change, whether it's big business or big unions or big government. How are we going to act differently because we've got ourselves into a terrible situation? So that's why we're posing the question and saying voters should ask political parties, is it better for somebody to be unemployed than to continue with what we're doing? And I think there are big choices in this election, and it's going to require much more active involvement by citizens and holding politicians accountable for the mess that we're in, and asking how they are going to change and how will they deal with the different vested interests to build a common vision for South Africans on how we get to a better society. And we can't keep doing what we've always done because it's not working. We will not get a different result.
That's where we're going to leave it for now. Thanks very much for coming through. The head of the Center for Development and Enterprise, Anne Bernstein.